was just after 11 p.m., and the rain was relentless. The steady drumbeat on the roof of my old Corolla blended with the swish of the wipers, which struggled to keep up with the downpour. The highway was empty, the world outside nothing but blurred streaks of wet asphalt and dark trees pressing in from both sides. I was on my last delivery for the night, a farm out in the countryside. These long, late-night drives always made me uneasy, but I needed the money. Losing my part-time job a month ago had left me scrambling for work, and deliveries were one of the few options I had. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to keep me afloat, at least for now. This was supposed to be a quick run, and then I could head home and relax with something mindless on Netflix. The thought of being warm and dry on my couch kept me focused as I navigated the winding backroads. Then I saw it, headlights up ahead, barely visible through the rain. As I drew closer, I realized the vehicle was moving far too slowly. It was an old pickup truck, creeping along the highway like its driver was afraid of the slick roads. I stayed behind it for a minute, waiting for an opportunity to pass, but it continued to swerve slightly, like the driver was struggling to stay in control. Growing impatient, I flipped on my signal and sped up to pass. Just as I pulled to the side, the truck suddenly veered off the road, tires screeching as it slid down an embankment into the trees. My heart jumped into my throat. I slammed on the brakes and pulled over, watching the truck's headlights flicker through the branches. For a few seconds, I just sat there, frozen. The truck hadn't crashed hard. I hadn't heard any loud impact, but something about the way it slipped into the darkness sent a wave of unease through me. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but of course, there was no signal this far out in the countryside. I couldn't just leave, though. What if the driver was injured? Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and got out of the car. The rain soaked me instantly, cold and biting against my skin, making the ground slippery beneath my feet as I made my way down the slope. The truck sat wedged between a couple of trees, its engine still running but no longer moving. I shone the flashlight through the driver's side window, but the glass was fogged over, and I couldn't see inside. I knocked and called out, asking if the driver was okay. No response. I tried the door handle and it creaked open. The smell of damp fabric and rain-soaked metal hit me as I peered inside. The driver, a man in his mid-40s by the looks of him, was slumped over the steering wheel. His hands were clenched tightly around it, and his eyes stared straight ahead, unfocused. I asked if he was hurt, but he didn't answer at first. After a long, uncomfortable pause, he turned his head slowly toward me, his eyes narrowing slightly as though trying to make sense of what I was saying. Then, in a quiet, almost mechanical voice, he asked if I could give him a ride. Something about the way he spoke made my skin crawl, but I couldn't just leave him there. I told him I could take him to the nearest gas station, and after a moment, he nodded. He stepped out of the truck, and I led him back up the slope toward my car. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, even when I wasn't looking at him. Every time I glanced back, he was staring right at me, his expression unreadable, his movements slow and deliberate. I tried to push the feeling aside, telling myself he was probably in shock from the crash, but it didn't help much. We got into the car, and the silence was immediate, suffocating. I started driving, the rain hammering against the windows, the wipers working overtime to clear the windshield. I tried making small talk, asking if he was hurt or if he remembered what happened before the crash, but he barely responded. He said he didn't know, his voice flat and emotionless. After a while, I gave up on conversation. The drive felt longer than it should have, the road stretching out endlessly in front of me, the GPS telling me we still had about 15 miles to go. The man just sat there, motionless, staring straight ahead. Every now and then, I'd glance over, and each time, he was watching me again, his eyes dark and intense. The tension in the car grew thicker with every passing minute, a weight pressing down on my chest. The rain seemed louder now, the darkness outside the windows impenetrable. I couldn't help but feel like something was wrong, like I'd made a terrible mistake by picking this man up. Finally, after what felt like hours, the lights of the gas station appeared in the distance. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the lot and parked under the awning. I told him we'd arrived, but he didn't move. I unbuckled my seatbelt, feeling my pulse quicken. Something wasn't right. I stepped out into the rain, telling him he could call for help inside the gas station. He turned to look at me, his eyes colder than before, and said, "You can't leave." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and my stomach lurched. I took a step back, stammering that I had to go. He got out of the car slowly, his movements deliberate, his gaze never leaving mine. Panic gripped me as I realized he wasn't going to let me leave. I bolted for the gas station door, yanking it open and stumbling inside. The cashier looked up, startled, but I barely registered him. I told him there was a man outside acting strange, that I needed him to call the police. He frowned, glancing out the window. "There's no one out there," he said. I turned and looked. The parking lot was empty. My car sat under the awning, its passenger door open, rain pouring onto the seat, but the man was gone. The road beyond was empty. There were no footprints, no signs of him at all. A cold dread settled in my stomach as I scanned the shadows between the gas pumps, the tree line in the distance. And then I saw him, standing at the edge of the forest, barely visible through the rain, just watching. "You can't leave," his words echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder of how close I'd come to something far worse than a simple car crash. Even now, standing in the gas station's fluorescent light, I knew he was still out there. Somewhere. Waiting. I was driving through the desolate backroads of Kentucky, trying to escape the gridlock on the highway. The interstate had been a mess, and I figured taking the scenic route home was a better option. It was nearly 1 a.m., and I relished the solitude, the quiet hum of my car as it sliced through the inky darkness. Only my headlights illuminated the narrow road ahead, their beams cutting through the mist that clung to the ground like some forgotten memory. The occasional flutter of leaves across the windshield was the only movement, as the dense woods on either side seemed to press in, hemming me into this isolated stretch of asphalt. I had my music on low, trying to keep my nerves steady. These roads had a way of playing with your mind, especially at this hour. Every curve felt like a mystery, every shadow a lurking figure. But I told myself it was just my imagination, the tricks of an overactive mind. I hadn't seen another car in what felt like miles. Then, out of nowhere, a chime from my dashboard broke the stillness. Low fuel. I muttered a curse under my breath. I hadn't even thought to check the tank before I left the highway. Glancing at the screen, I saw I was running dangerously low. I pulled over and checked my phone, searching for the nearest gas station. The app told me there was one just a few miles up the road. Relieved, I put the car back in gear and continued on, keeping an eye on the fuel gauge. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the dim glow of lights ahead, a tiny gas station tucked in the middle of nowhere. The sign above the building flickered, barely holding on to life, casting an unsettling greenish hue across the lot. The place looked like it had been plucked straight out of another decade, its worn-out pumps standing like sentinels in the night. It wasn't exactly welcoming, but I didn't have a choice. I needed gas. I pulled up to one of the pumps, turning off the engine. Just as I stepped out, I noticed an old, battered pickup truck parked a few pumps over. The kind of truck that had seen more than a few hard years, its paint peeling and rust creeping along its sides. A man was standing beside it, filling up his tank. He was tall, his face obscured by the brim of a dirty baseball cap. He glanced at me for a moment, just long enough to make my skin crawl, before returning his attention to the pump. I tried to shake off the unease as I headed inside the store. The bell above the door jangled when I stepped in, the sound too loud in the oppressive quiet. The place was dimly lit, the shelves sparsely stocked with snacks and drinks. Behind the counter, the clerk, a middle-aged woman with heavy bags under her eyes, barely acknowledged my presence. I grabbed a coffee and a pack of gum, paid for my gas in cash, and headed back outside. The man by the truck was still there, fiddling with something in his pocket. He didn't look at me this time, but I could feel his presence like a weight pressing against my chest. I hurried to fill up my tank, my hands shaky as I handled the nozzle. I just wanted to get out of there, back on the road where at least the loneliness didn't feel threatening. After a few minutes, I finished fueling and climbed back into my car. As I pulled away from the station, I noticed something odd. The pickup truck hadn't moved. The man had just disappeared into the shadows, leaving the truck sitting there in the lot, dark and silent. I told myself not to think too much of it. Maybe he had gone inside, or maybe he was just resting before getting back on the road. But that sinking feeling in my gut didn't go away. I was barely a mile down the road when a new sound interrupted the quiet, a soft thumping noise. At first, I thought it was something from my playlist, but then I realized it was coming from my car. I glanced down at the dashboard and saw the tire pressure warning light glowing red. My heart sank. I pulled over, stepping out to inspect the tires. Sure enough, the rear passenger tire was completely flat. I hadn't hit anything, and the road had been clear. Something felt wrong about this. My mind immediately flashed back to the man at the gas station. Had he done something to my car while I wasn't looking? I grabbed my phone, intending to call for roadside assistance, but the screen stubbornly refused to load the app. There was no signal out here. Cursing my luck, I retrieved the jack and spare tire from the trunk, mentally preparing myself for the frustrating process of changing the tire in near-total darkness. Just as I was kneeling down to start, I heard the low, unmistakable growl of an engine behind me. My blood ran cold. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, and turned to face the road. In the distance, I could barely make out the shape of a vehicle. No headlights, just a hulking silhouette creeping up the road behind me. I recognized it immediately. The old pickup truck. It rolled to a stop about 100 feet away, idling in the middle of the road, its engine humming ominously. My first instinct was to get back in the car and lock the doors, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. Why had he followed me? What did he want? The truck's engine cut off, leaving a heavy silence hanging in the air. I fumbled for my phone, trying to call 911, but the screen still showed no signal. My fingers shook as I backed toward the edge of the woods. Maybe if I could hide, he'd just leave. But as I moved, I heard the unmistakable creak of a door opening and then closing softly. I ducked behind a tree, pressing myself into the shadows. My breathing was ragged, my mind racing. I had to stay calm, had to stay hidden. Maybe he was just checking on me. Maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something was very, very wrong. Footsteps crunched on the gravel, slow and deliberate, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. He was close now, too close. I held my breath, peering around the tree trunk just enough to see him. He was standing by my car, looking down at the flat tire. I could hear him muttering to himself, but the words were too low to make out. Then, with a sudden motion, he turned and walked back toward his truck. Relief washed over me. Maybe he was leaving. But instead of driving off, he opened the bed of his truck and pulled something out. It was too dark to see what it was, but the way he handled it made my stomach twist into knots. I had to get out of here. Without thinking, I bolted deeper into the woods, hoping the trees would provide enough cover. My footfalls were loud, echoing in the stillness of the forest, but I didn't care. I just needed to put as much distance between me and that truck as possible. I didn't stop until my lungs were burning, until the gas station and the road felt like distant memories. I crouched behind a thick cluster of bushes, trying to catch my breath. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that man? What had he wanted? And how had he known I'd stopped there? After what felt like hours, I heard the distant growl of an engine starting again, and then it faded into the night. He was gone, at least for now. But I didn't move, too afraid that if I stepped out, he'd somehow reappear. Eventually, I gathered the courage to creep back toward the road. My car was still there, the flat tire the only sign that anything had been wrong. But the pickup truck was gone, swallowed up by the night. I climbed back into the driver's seat, locking the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I tried once again to call for help. This time, the signal bars flickered back to life. I dialed 911 and explained everything about the flat tire, the man who had followed me, the truck. The operator's voice was calm, reassuring, but nothing could shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than a flat tire. The police arrived within 20 minutes, but by then, the pickup truck was long gone, and the trail of fear it had left behind me was already fading into the night. As the officer took my statement, I glanced back down the road, half expecting to see that truck's headlights emerging from the shadows. But all that greeted me was the vast, empty stretch of road, as quiet and dark as it had been before. And though I drove away that night, I couldn't help but feel that the man, and the darkness that followed him, still lingered out there, waiting. I never imagined that my first job out of college would involve late-night food deliveries. I had studied hard, graduated with a degree, and yet, like many people in their early 20s, I found myself hustling through gig work just to make ends meet. Delivery jobs were flexible, at least, and I didn't mind the driving, especially at night when the streets were quiet and I could blast my music to keep myself awake. Most of my deliveries were standard. Pick up food, drop it off at some house or apartment, and move on. By the time Friday rolled around, I had fallen into the rhythm of things. But on this particular Friday, everything shifted. That night was the start of something that would stick with me, haunt me, in ways I couldn't shake off. It was a normal day up until the end of my shift. I had already delivered my last scheduled order, ready to call it a night, when a notification popped up on my app. McDonald's delivery to an address at the outskirts of town. That was strange. It was nearly midnight, and I'd never seen an order come in so far from the usual routes, especially from a place like McDonald's. Most of my deliveries were to apartments downtown, not some forgotten corner near the city's edge. I hesitated. The app told me it was only 15 minutes away, though, and the payout was decent. Besides, I didn't want to tank my rating by rejecting it. I accepted the order. The restaurant was still open when I arrived, and everything felt off. The fluorescent lights inside seemed brighter than usual, almost too bright, like they were glaring at me. There was a weird tension in the air. It wasn't the usual hustle and bustle I'd come to expect from late-night fast food spots. The employees, who were usually rushing around with half-hearted smiles, seemed unusually quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I brushed it off as end-of-the-week exhaustion. I just wanted to get this last delivery done and get home. After I picked up the bag of food, the feeling intensified. My hands felt clammy as I held the warm, grease-stained paper bag. I remember glancing back at the receipt, trying to make sense of why this particular order made my skin crawl. It was just a cheeseburger, fries, and a Coke. Nothing unusual, but the name listed for the delivery was simply M. I didn't dwell on it for too long. Just get it over with, I told myself. The drive to the address was quiet, too quiet. As I left the main roads, the city lights faded behind me, replaced by the eerie glow of my headlights on the empty streets. The houses became sparse, more and more run down as I approached the outskirts of the city. There was no sign of life. No other cars, no people, not even a stray dog. It felt like I had driven into a forgotten pocket of the world. The address led me to a narrow street lined with dilapidated warehouses. Most of them were dark and boarded up, as though they hadn't been touched in years. I kept glancing at my phone's GPS, thinking it must have made a mistake, but the blinking dot insisted I was in the right place. The house I was supposed to deliver to was at the very end of the street. When I pulled up in front of it, I almost wished I hadn't. The building wasn't a house in the traditional sense. It was more of an old, low-slung industrial warehouse that had been converted into some kind of living space, or at least that's what it seemed like. The windows were dark, grimy, and the overgrown bushes and weeds suggested no one had lived there for a while. But the lights were on inside, faint and flickering like they were struggling to stay alive. I parked my car a little way down the street, my headlights slicing through the gloom. As I sat there, staring at the building, that uneasy feeling crept back up my spine. Something was wrong here, very wrong. I didn't want to get out, but the app pinged, reminding me that I had to complete the delivery. I sighed, grabbed the bag of food, and forced myself to step out into the cold night air. The street was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of gravel under my shoes as I made my way toward the entrance. When I reached the door, I hesitated. There was no doorbell, no real indication of where to leave the food. The delivery instructions were vague, too, just the address and nothing more. Normally, I'd leave it on the doorstep and snap a picture for proof, but this place didn't even have a proper doorstep. Just a rusted metal door with peeling paint. I tried calling the customer. It rang, and I was just about to hang up when someone finally answered. The voice on the other end was low and hoarse, like they hadn't spoken in days. "Yeah." The word was drawn out, raspy, as if the person had just woken up or maybe never really slept. Hi, I have your McDonald's delivery," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll just leave it at the door for you." "No," the voice interrupted sharply. "Bring it inside." I paused, glancing back at my car. Every instinct told me to leave the food and get out of there, but then I thought about my rating. If this guy complained, it could screw me over, maybe even cost me the job. I swallowed my discomfort and forced myself to comply. "Okay," I said reluctantly. "I'll bring it in." The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit hallway. The lights overhead flickered weakly, casting long shadows along the cracked walls. I stepped inside, the door clanging shut behind me with a finality that made my heart skip a beat. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing down the empty corridor. The air inside was thick and stale, like the place hadn't been ventilated in ages. My footsteps echoed unervingly as I walked deeper into the building, carrying the food bag in one hand, the other gripping my phone like a lifeline. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, every step making me feel more isolated, more trapped. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows that danced along the walls, and the deeper I went, the colder it got. I reached what looked like the main room, a large, empty space filled with dusty old furniture and stacks of cardboard boxes. The place looked abandoned, except for the faint sound of something moving deeper in the shadows. A chair creaked in the corner, but I couldn't see anyone. It felt like I had just stepped onto the set of some low-budget horror film. I cleared my throat, trying to push away the creeping dread. "Hello? Your order is here." No response. I waited a few moments, my heart thudding in my chest. The silence was unbearable, pressing in on me from all sides. I glanced back down the hallway, the way I came, feeling a sudden urge to run. I had done my part, right? I could leave, but something kept me rooted in place. That's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from deeper within the warehouse. I spun around, searching the shadows, but saw nothing. My skin prickled with unease. Screw this. I set the food down on a dusty electrical panel near the entrance and hurriedly typed a message to the customer through the app. "Your order's inside, on the panel by the entrance." Almost instantly, my phone buzzed with a reply. "Stay. Come in further. I need you to bring it to the back." I stared at the message, my stomach twisting into knots. There was no way I was going any further. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, like I had walked straight into a trap. My breathing quickened as I typed back a hasty response. "Orders inside. I'm leaving now." Another message buzzed through. "Stay. You're already here. Don't make me come find you." That did it. I bolted for the door, not caring how loud my footsteps echoed through the hallway. The walls seemed to close in on me as I ran, every flicker of light overhead making my heart pound harder. When I reached the exit, I shoved the door open and stumbled into the cold night air, gasping for breath. My hands shook as I fumbled for my car keys. The moment I slid into the driver's seat, I tried to start the engine, but it sputtered. I cursed under my breath, trying again. The car groaned, the engine catching just as I saw movement from the corner of my eye. A figure was emerging from the warehouse, tall and hulking, their face hidden beneath some kind of mask. In one hand, they held what looked like a bat or a metal pipe. The dim light from the warehouse doorway cast an eerie glow on the figure as they stepped closer, the bat swinging casually by their side. Panic surged through me as I jammed the key into the ignition and twisted it harder. The engine roared to life on the third try, and I floored the gas, the tires screeching as I tore down the street. My heart was hammering in my chest, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel as I sped away from that cursed place. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure standing in the middle of the street, watching me as I disappeared into the night. I didn't stop driving until I was well back into the city, surrounded by lights and people. But the memory of that night has never left me. The figure, the voice, the unsettling feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than I could ever comprehend. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I still think about that place, about what would have happened if I had stayed just a moment longer. And I wonder if that figure is still out there, waiting for another unlucky soul to make the same mistake.